deploying Configuration Manager clients. Okay, in the last nugget, we spent some time actually discovering what sorts of resources are available on our domain and on our network. And now that we understand what those resources are, we want to actually take the ones that we can deploy clients to and actually begin the process of deploying clients. Now, if you remember, the discovery process doesn't really bring a lot of information into our database. It brings some basic information that allows us to know that resources are there and maybe even potentially connect to those resources and apply clients. But what we're really looking for is all that nice, rich inventory information that it comes once the client is installed onto those systems. Now, for us to get clients installed onto systems, there's actually an installation process, just like we would with any application. We need to install the client. And we also need to essentially configure those clients so that the clients are providing the information that we want back to the database. We also need to bound the clients in terms of where we want to install clients and where we may not want to install clients. You'll see the first item on here is called boundaries. Essentially, we're going to set up either IP address based or Active Directory site based. Essentially, what is the outer boundary that we want this configuration management server to be responsible for? If you think about it, even if you have a single domain, maybe your domain spans a number of different sites, or maybe it spans a number of different business units, and you want certain parts of your domain to be under management by a particular configuration management server, but other parts may be under the purview of a different IT organization. So because of this, you may want to set your boundaries to just limit where your configuration manager site server is actually managing those clients. We're going to talk a little bit about client approval and the auto approval process as well. You know, if you can set clients to be automatically approved by a configuration manager instance if they're if they're in a trusted domain, or you can say, no, I want all of the new clients to have to go through a manual approval process. It really depends on the amount of involvement that you want to have with approving clients into your infrastructure. We're going to talk about some different client installation methods too. There are actually a number of different ways that you can install the client onto a potential workstation or server inside of your environment. And depending on where your environment's at and what sort of skills you have and what sort of technologies you have at your disposal, some of these methods may be easier than other methods. One of these, and just skipping over this one of these that we'll talk about specifically is called the client push installation. And once we have discovery data in our configuration manager instance, then we can also then just push clients out from the configuration manager console to individual clients using the client push installation. I want to talk very briefly about client agents. There are actually 10 different client agents that can be installed and actually set to enable on the clients. Each of these agents provides a certain level of functionality that the client then provides back to the server. And depending on what you want to manage in your environment, you may or may not enable some or all of these agents so that the client provides that information back. And then lastly, we'll actually look at the client itself. We'll take a look at an example Windows XP system, for example, and show you what the configuration manager client looks like on that system so you can get a view for really what is the user going to see inside of their control panel once the client gets installed. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize this, and I'm going to bring up the second item here to talk a little bit about those specific methods that you can use, and there are 7 methods for getting the client onto the server. Now you'll see here we have methods called client push and software update point, group policy, and manual. Really, again, installing the client is just like installing an application, and you want to be able to do it in a way that is easiest for you. The easiest in some cases may be the client push method, and we'll just show what that looks like in the interface here in a minute. But the client push method, as we said before, is essentially from the configuration manager console, you see systems out in your environment that don't have the client, and you want to push them or deploy that client automatically through the interface. If you don't have that easy capability and you want to deploy clients to servers that may already have, for example, a WSUS infrastructure or connected into a WSUS infrastructure, we can use another automated tool called the software update point installation method. Now, the software update point has some benefits over client push in that I don't actually have to, or you don't actually have to click the button to deploy the clients. You just say, okay, well, go ahead and push them now. With software updates, you can say, okay, I'm going to set a policy just like I would for a WSUS approval that says at the next update cycle, go ahead and install these clients, and if they're not installed, keep trying, more or less. If I don't have that WSUS infrastructure in place, I can use group policy or manual methods, for example, to install that client as well. Maybe I I want to go from machine to machine with a CD in my hand or a file share somewhere and double-click the CCM setup file and begin the process. Or maybe I want to deploy it through a group policy if I'm happy or friendly with group policy and comfortable with using it. I can use a logon script method as well if I want. The logon script method is different from the group policy or manual in that the client is actually installed as a component of a logon script. Now be aware that the installation of the Configuration Manager console requires administrative access for installation. So using a logon script may or may not actually bring that client in or start that installation using administrative privileges. We can also use software distribution, and this is not necessarily used for the installation of a new client because you can't use Configuration Manager's software distribution to install the client because the client's not there. But what you can do is use software distribution to upgrade existing clients because the client version will change over time. As Microsoft finds problems with the client or they make updates or bug checks or bug fixes with the clients, you may need to upgrade the client to support that additional functionality. And you can use your software distribution, essentially your configuration management infrastructure, to be able to deploy the clients. And then lastly, if you do imaging for your systems, if you use Ghost or if you use Windows Deployment Services or any one of the imaging tools that are out there on the market right now for rapidly deploying workstations and servers, you can actually use the imaging method to deploy the client as well. What effectively you do in this method is you install the client using perhaps the manual method onto your golden image or your reference image. And then once you've installed that client, then you need to strip out all of the unique information about that client, maybe what site it's pointing to and any of the special configurations associated with it. Because once you've got that, you want to make it more or less a clean client that has no configuration, so that once it begins to be deployed, once it's imaged out to multiple machines, the machines are going to take on their own personality. Configuration Manager is going to discover and then ultimately recognize the client and pull it into the hierarchy. Of these, we are specifically going to talk about the client push installation and also the software update point installation methods. I do at this point actually want to go ahead and minimize this, and I want to show you where some of those client agents are available on the system so you can find them for yourself. If we go to my computer here and we go to the C drive and program files and we look for Microsoft Configuration Manager, we're going to go back in here again and take a look at the file structure of Configuration Manager itself. You'll see in here a subfolder called Client, and this is installed by default when you install Configuration Manager. This is going to be essentially where you can find the client installation file ccmsetup.exe. This is the location, or this is the file that you would use to actually deploy the client to a workstation. And the benefit of using this exe file, whether it's for the manual method or what have you, is that the ccmsetup.exe file has a number of additional or switches that you can use to customize the installation of that client. If I click in here under i386 or A64, there are a number of additional files and folders that are additional installations that may be required in order to get that client up to the level that is required. You'll see MSXML6 here and WinAGPI and those sorts of elements. These may be required just to get the client to the level where it can have the client installation there. So consider this a level of prerequisites for your client installation. But this ccmsetup.exe file in this location is the executable that's used for a lot of those manual type installations. The only change instead of using this file, if you're going to use the group policy mechanism for deploying the client, you may instead, because group policy doesn't deploy exes, it deploys MSIs, you may want to locate in the bin folder here instead of the clients folder in i386, look for ccmsetup.msi. This is a specially configured MSI file that is roughly equivalent to the exe file, but is designed to be used using group policy and group policy software distribution. So if you're using group policy and you want to deploy your client using group policy, in that case and in that case only, you may consider using this ccmsetup.msi file as the tool for actually deploying the client. So be aware that inside of your configuration management folder, that's where you're going to find the bits and the bytes that you need in order to get that client installed onto your network if you want to use some of the more manual type methods or some of the more, I'll say, out of band type methods. In addition to client methods, we also talked about something called client agents. And we're going to talk about client agents in a little bit, but really what client agents are is 10 different pieces of functionality that a particular client may have. So for example, each client may want to pull hardware inventory, and it may want to pull software inventory. You may want to be able to advertise programs to it, or the basic client bits itself, or desired configuration manager, or maybe it's mobile device, or maybe you want to be able to remote it through remote tools, or use network access protection, or do software metering, or software updates. All of these client agents are essentially the little pieces of the client that provide functionality, that enable functionality that the client can then scan the system, interrogate the system, and provide that information back to the configuration manager database. So as part of this client installation process, we're also going to enable these agents so you can see what different kinds of functionality is going to be available on the client once that client gets deployed to our environment. So all this being said, let's go ahead and minimize this, and let's go bring up our configuration manager client again. You'll see we're here at CBN, our CBN site, and what we want to do first is actually talk about the boundaries. Now, there are a lot of different ways in which you can deploy boundaries for your site, and I'm going to click here under New Boundary to create the settings for a new boundary. Now, I want to drop down the type box here so I can show you the 4 different tools that we can use, or 4 different categories of boundaries that we can create. One is going to be an IP subnet. If I have essentially a subnet that defines the location where I want to manage those clients, I can enter an IP subnet in there. I can also enter in an Active Directory site. Perhaps my sites and my subnets are not necessarily one-to-one. Perhaps I'm more interested in saying, okay, for this entire site, all of the members of this site, or perhaps in a fast LAN link. And so I want to manage all of those machines in that Active Directory site as a single unit. Or instead, maybe I want to go subnet by subnet. The difference here is going to be whether or not the connection between those sites and this site are going to be fast or going to be slow. You'll see down here that we have network connection, and we see clients in this boundary communicate with the site, meaning the site server that we're looking at here, by using a network that is either slow or fast. And so when you're thinking about the architecture of your network, and this is definitely an engineering task, when you're thinking about the architecture of your network, think about which connections are fast and which connections are slow. And those connections that are slow should have their own boundary configured so that the internal communication between those boundaries can be done in such a way so that it doesn't saturate the network line. In our case, we're going to use an IP subnet here because the IP subnet we're using contains all the hosts that are being used in this environment. It's a very small environment for this test environment. So we'll say CBT Nuggets Network. Oops, going to misspell there. Network. And the network here is going to be 192.168 0.0, 255, 255, 255.0. Again, just like before, this is going to be the 192.168 network, and we're going to look for all of the hosts between 192.168 0.1 through 192.168 0.254. You'll see the subnet ID is actually marked here. If I had, for example, instead of an entire subnet, if I wanted to do individual IP addresses, maybe half a subnet, or maybe I'm not comfortable with subnets and how subnet masking works, I can say instead of choosing a subnet, I can choose an IP address range instead and say, okay, I just want .1 through .254. The decision is up to you, but again, you want to make sure that these boundaries are set before you begin deploying clients, because boundaries are required by clients in order for them to know where they need to go, which site server they need to connect to. So I'm going to leave this as subnet, and we're going to create this boundary as a fast network connection because this is all within the same single LAN. I click OK here, and you'll see that the boundary is created. Here's our list of our boundary here. Once the boundary is created, we can then begin deploying clients, and only once the boundary is created can we then begin deploying clients. The next thing we want to do is validate the approval configuration for our server. And we do that by going up here to the site name here and choosing properties. And what I want to do first is go to the site mode tab. And you'll see here that just like we said when we installed the site, we've installed the site in mixed mode as opposed to native mode because we don't have a PKI infrastructure that we're currently leveraging. You'll see down here we have a box to choose for approval settings. And this chooses how we want to approve computers that are attempting to join the site. Do I want to manually approve each computer? When a computer attempts to join my site, do I want to have to manually say, okay, yes, this is a good computer, I want to bring it into the site? Or do I want to perhaps automatically approve computers that are in trusted domains? So if I have domains that are trusted, do I want to say, okay, well, I'm just going to trust that you're brought into the domain using an approved account, which means that you're probably okay to bring into my configuration manager instance through it because of that approved account. Essentially, I'm doing a chain of trust all the way back to the person that brought that computer on the network. Lastly, I can just say automatically approve all computers, and it shows here that this is not recommended because it very easily makes it possible for rogue computers to attempt to work their way into your environment. So be aware that you may want to choose the level of trust that you have for approving clients. If you don't trust them, you may want to manually approve, and if you do, you may want to choose automatic approval. You have a checkbox down here for choosing whether or not the site contains Configuration Manager 2007 or if it also includes SMS 2003 clients. You can also choose to select how inventory data is transferred to the site, whether or not data is going to be encrypted before sending to the management point. Now, you may want to encrypt that data if you're concerned about the client data being intercepted on its transport between the client and the management point. However, the encrypting of that data is going to involve some additional processor resources because that's just what it takes in order to encrypt and decrypt data as it goes through its transport from one place to another. So there's going to be a trade-off there between security and performance on the server. If you're all in a single LAN, and you trust the network connections in that LAN, you may not necessarily need to encrypt that data as it goes from client to management point. I'm going to switch over here to the Advanced tab as well because we have one element we want to talk about here. We're going to talk about the other ones later, but under conflicting records, occasionally you may find duplicate hardware IDs. And a lot of times this happens if you forget to change the SID on a server after or a workstation after you get done imaging it. In those cases, when you haven't done that, the Configuration Manager hardware ID may come in and you may have duplicate ones inside of your environment. When that happens, in the old days, you used to have to go and figure out which ones had the duplicates and identify the machine and reset the machine and re-bring it back and put a new client on it, and it was sort of a painful process. Nowadays, we can either manually resolve those conflicting records or we can automatically just say, okay, if I get a duplicate hardware ID, I can go ahead and create a new client record to make sure that those client records are different and separate. So that helps us out in those situations where we have those duplicate hardware IDs. I'm going to click OK here, and that takes us back to our Manager console. The last step that we want to go through before we actually begin the process of pushing to clients is actually referring to the client agents and enabling client agents that are of interest to us. Here are the client agents that we talked about when we were showing the different whiteboards, the different agents on the whiteboard. You'll see there are 10 of them here. And we want to go through each of these agents one by one to determine whether or not we are interested in the information that is provided from that agent. Again, this is functionality that is instructed for the client to enable or disable. If you make a change to any of these after deploying clients, the clients will not automatically make the change. But the next time they do their policy refresh interval, which I believe is like 60 minutes, when they do their policy refresh interval, then and only then will they make those changes associated with what you've done here in the interface. So be aware, this is not something that you set and forget and then you never look at again. Over time, you may want to change some of this, and changing it here will inevitably and slowly work its way out to the individual clients on your network. Let's go through these one at a time to see what each one of these does. First off is the hardware inventory client agent. And you can see here that we do indeed by default enable hardware inventory. This is information like how much RAM is on the server and or in the workstation and how much processors on there and disk and those sorts of things. We're running hardware inventory every 7 days. So every 7 days we instruct our clients to actually give us more hardware information and update that hardware information. You may find that 7 days is not enough for you. You may find that you have more change in your environments, maybe need to reduce that down from 7 days to 1 day or less than that. By reducing that amount, that schedule to a smaller number, your data is going to be fresher. You're going to have fresher data, but it's going to involve more requirements, more impact on the needs of the server because clients are going to be coming in to provide their information at a much greater interval, a much less interval. So there's again here a trade-off between the freshness of the data and then also how much do you want that server to have to work with that data as well. If I click OK here, we're going to go to software inventory, and we're going to look here, and you'll see here that software inventory is also being run every 7 days. Now, this is a very important one here because you may find that 7 days is not enough data or not fresh enough for the software as you're deploying it. If you think about it, if I go and deploy a piece of software to a new workstation, and I don't want to have to wait up to 7 days for that workstation to give me back software inventory based on the changes that I've made, maybe I want to reduce this number down. Maybe I don't want it to be 7 days. Maybe every day I want all of my clients to report in with their software inventory. Again, that's going to involve some performance hit on the server, but I get fresher data that way. I'll leave it at 7 for now because 7 is the default number of days, but you may want to change that to what is comfortable for you and what is familiar. I want to click here under Inventory Collection because I can also specifically determine what types of files I want to inventory on each client. You can see here that I'm now inventorying exe files. Exe files are essentially, all the executables on my hard disks. I'm saying, okay, tell me on anywhere on the client, anywhere on any client hard disk, including subdirectories, give me the metadata about every exe file that's available and out there on my clients. If it's encrypted, if it's compressed, include that. If it's a file in the Windows directory, include that. I'm going to actually click this box because I want to include the exes that are in the Windows directory. I want to know what level, what version number those exes are at. Another good tool that another good type of file that I may want to collect is perhaps DLL files. I can do that by saying, okay, give me star.dll. all the DLL files in the system that are encrypted, compressed, and in the Windows directory as well. Now, just like we talked about before, the more inventory that we collect, the more that the server has to work in order to keep that in the database, and the larger the database is going to be. So before you get crazy and do something like try to collect star.star, be aware that you do have to be able to support all of that data in your database and the performance of the server also in the collection process. We can also collect files. Now, the inventory collection tab, whereas the inventory collection tab gave us metadata about the files. So I want to know what's the version number and where is it located at and what its name is. Maybe in some cases I may want to actually collect the file itself. And in that case, I can click this star here and actually give information about the file that I want to collect. Now remember, and this is very, very important, if you collect, as it says down here, large or numerous files, can really, really, really be a hog on your network traffic and clog up the space on your configuration management server and really slow things down. So be very careful with collecting files. You'll see here that the maximum file size by default is only 128K. You're not going to be going out and saying, okay, collect star.doc on my network, because it's going to start pulling in every Word document on your network into your configuration management server, and it's probably not something that you want to do. I'm going to leave this alone right now because we're not really interested in collecting files at this point. Lastly, I have the choice of selecting, okay, in my inventory, based off of what the display name is, what sort of inventory names are out there? What kind of names are being given to me, and how should I convert them into something that is displayed so it has a common display name there? For the most part, you probably won't be modifying this too much, but if you have specific inventory names that you want to make sure convert to a more friendly display name, you can do so at this location here. So that's the software inventory client agent. Advertise Programs is the tool that allows me to actually deploy software to my clients. You'll see here by default this is enabled as well, and it allows user-targeted advertisement requests, meaning I can actually target to specific users instead of to specific computers the actual advertisements that I want to create. If you're unfamiliar with this process of software distribution and advertisements, don't worry, we're going to return to this when we talk about the software distribution process later on in this series. But for now, know that the client agent for enabling software distribution is enabled and checked right here in the box. New program notification icon says, okay, if I'm deploying a program out, am I going to automatically open add remove programs? Or as it shows here in the notification tab, do I even want to display notification messages to my users when I've made advertised programs available to them? In some cases I may, in some cases I may not. It depends on the level of impact or level of involvement that I want my users to have in the advertised programs and the software deployment process. I'm going to click OK here, having not changed anything. Computer Client Agent is more or less the core of the client agent itself. In this case, we may want to choose a network access account, the access account that allows the client agent to talk to the network. In this case, I can do nugget lab/administrator and then put in the password. This allows my client to talk to the network using this network access account. I can say, okay, how often do I want the client to poll for new policies? I told you before that there was a 60-minute interval between when clients attempt to ask the configuration site server for if there are new policies. And you'll see here, this is a 60-minute interval. I can say, how often do I want my state messages? How often do I want my event log messages to be sent to the management point? In this case, it's 15 minutes. I can customize how I want my client messages to look to my users. Well, what's the organization name? What's some software updates? What do I want my users to see whenever I'm deploying software updates or software or operating systems? Do I want any reminders to be done? Mandatory reminders for software distribution advertisements or task sequence or software updates when we're looking at the users itself. Do I want to require bits? Do I want to throttle bits whenever I'm working whether to all clients or to clients and branch distribution points? So for example, I may want to throttle bits so that the level of network usage used by bits from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. is throttled down so that it's not going to be an impact on my network connection between here and the low bandwidth connection to my branch distribution point. I can actually say, okay, do I want to allow bits downloads outside of the throttling window? So between the hours of 5 p.m. and 9 a.m., do I want to allow bits downloads to occur there as well? And then lastly, do I want to specify default restart settings? Essentially, if I have to restart my clients, do I want to give them 5 minutes or do I want to give them 10 minutes for the restart countdown? Do I want to give them a final notification so that they're aware when I attempt to do a restart on their computer of how much time they may have to finish up their last tasks before their machine gets force rebooted as part of a software installation or other activity? I'm going to click OK here. We're going to talk about desired configuration management. In a later nugget, we're going to actually discuss desired configuration management, but here we show that we have enabled that management on the computer and it's running every 7 days. We'll talk more specifics about that a little bit later. For mobile devices, we can also enable the mobile device client agent too, and we'll talk about this client in our nugget on mobile device client. Remote tools are useful for clients as well, because one of the reasons why we deploy Configuration Manager is because we want to be able to remote our clients. We want our help desk to be able to look over the shoulder virtually and see on our clients what the user is seeing on their screen. Here we have the ability to enable remote tools. We also may want to say that the users cannot change the policy or notifications. In other words, if I set that I have the ability to view and interact with any client workstation, I don't want my users going back and saying, you know what, I don't really want you to do that, and changing the settings later on. For clients running Windows 2000, do we want to offer full control or no access for the level of access? For XP or later, do we want to offer view only or full control access? We can choose security. What are the names of the users and the groups permitted to view and control client computers? I may want to go through here and offer a user or a group name, maybe domain administrators. Okay? Notification says, okay, when I'm actually working with remote tools, when I'm actually remoting another client, do I want to display a visual indicator on the desktop or on the taskbar so that the user knows that I'm attempting to work with their system? Do I want to play a sound? Do I want to play it sound repeatedly or as the session begins and ends? The sound may be annoying. I may not want to display the sound. I may want to be able to work on those systems without annoying the people that are sitting around the users. Remote assistance is used for clients that support remote assistance like Windows XP and above. Do I want to configure those solicited and unsolicited remote assistance settings, and what do I want to configure them to be? Do I just want to view the console, or do I want to allow full control, meaning that I can interact with the remote system and perform changes and do things without the user being there? The same thing with remote desktop. If my clients support remote desktop, do I want to configure remote desktop settings to allow permitted viewers to connect using a remote desktop connection? I have the ability to check the network access protection client agent. We'll talk about network access protection in a later nugget as well. I can choose the software metering client. And with here, I can choose, okay, Configuration Manager, go ahead and tell me what types of applications people are using and how long they're using it and what times of day are they using it. We'll talk about software metering in a later nugget as well. And software updates, WSUS, what we're used to seeing. Do I want to enable software updates so that the Configuration Manager client actually handles software updates and software deployment for me? We'll also talk about that in a future nugget. So a lot of these client agents we're just sort of glossing over at this point because you need to be aware that you may want to enable them. And you need to be aware of sort of what types of agents you're going to make use of in your Configuration Manager instance so that we can deploy the clients with those agents already enabled for the clients. So now that we understand what these client agents are, or at least in their general perspective, what they can do for us, let's spend some time now actually going through the process of deploying clients. In order to do that, what I want to do first actually is show you here under Computer Management. If I go to Collections, you'll remember in the last nugget we enabled the discovery process to discover all of the resources in our domain. And we said, okay, we'll point it to the domain and tell us all of the computers that are currently attached or have records inside of our Active Directory. And you'll see here we have a number of computers that actually have records inside of our Active Directory. Here's our sccm nugget. This is nugget 1. This is our Windows XP workstation. We'll talk about in a second. Here's our domain controller, DC nugget, as well as various other systems that are in Active Directory that are in our domain that we may want to manage. In our case, we want to deploy a client to Nugget 1. This is the Windows XP workstation that's in a domain, and this is the workstation that we will use actually as sort of our test bed for deploying some packages and for using some of the tools that we'll use inside of Configuration Manager. In order for us to deploy that to Nugget 1, we're going to use the client push installation method. You'll see here before we do that the resource type is system and that the domain is Nugget Lab, and we currently do not have a client, and that is the client is currently not assigned to a particular site server. So what we need to do is turn these no's into yeses to make that client fully manageable by Configuration Manager. In order to do that, we're going to scroll back up here. We're going to go to Client Installation Methods, and you'll see here this Client Push Installation method here. I'm going to open this up, and we're going to enable Client Push Installation to assign resources. You'll see the box pops up that says that we have chosen to enable Client Push Installation, but in order to install the software, we must apply the change to the Client Push Installation Properties dialog box, and then ensure that a discovery method is run on the site. We've already run that discovery method on the site. You'll see here that we are going to attempt to push the client to servers, workstations, and in our case, even domain controllers, and even to site systems, because we want our site systems to be managed by our site system. We want to understand what's going on in the site systems and have their information, have their configuration managed by a configuration manager. We have to provide an account as well. If we choose in here to select a client push installation account, we can give it the username again. That's going to be Nugget Lab Administrator, and then the password for administrator, and then client. We can also, if we know what the installation properties are, if you've ever done any MSI custom installations where you put installation properties in with the MSI, you can see here that we can add those installation properties in here. Maybe that installation property is we want to say the SMS site code is equal to CBN, or maybe we want to set the cache size to 10,000 megabytes instead of the standard size of 5,120 megabytes. Any of these that are available, you'll see on in the SMS documentation for additional installation properties. But for the most part here, all we really want to do at this point is set our site code to CBN so that we can tell our clients to talk to the CBN site so that they can begin communicating back and forth and sending their data. Once we've done this, we now have client push installation ready to go. But this is a manual process, and so for us to be able to begin the process of pushing the clients out to the servers that are on our network, we need to go down to collections node here, just where we were before, and choose all systems. The client push installation is an administrator-driven activity, and because it's an administrator-driven activity, we need to actually begin the process anytime we want to deploy those clients out. So for example, here's our sccm Nugget installation here. If we right-click sccm Nugget, we can see that the link here for install client. If we click the install client button, you'll see that we've begun the client push installation wizard. If I click next here, you'll see that I can choose, okay, we'll include only clients in the site boundaries, or always install, which says even if there's a client on there, always install, always upgrade existing clients, always repair existing clients. I just want to get the client on that system. If I click next here, you'll see all the installation details, and clicking finish will begin the process in the background of deploying that client. One way that I can immediately test to see if the client is indeed being deployed is by going to Task Manager and looking for the ccmsetup.exe file. You'll see here that ccmsetup.exe, which is the file that we talked about just a minute ago, has actually been lost on the client and is beginning the process of actually configuring that client. The configuration process can take a period of time to complete, and we'll know whenever it's complete is when that ccmsetup.exe file has actually been converted to a ccm exec, which is the configuration manager executive service, which actually runs the client itself. We can do the same thing by clicking on any one of the individual instances here to install the client, or we can choose on collections and install the client to any member of any collection. So from here I can choose I can choose the all systems collection, for example, and choose to install the client to all of the systems in that collection. It's the same options as it was before, except I now have the choice of selecting sub-collections in addition to my collection as well. So if I've created nested collections, I can say, you know what? All the systems that are in that collection, go ahead, and all the sub-collections too, go ahead and begin installing the client on all the systems that are a member of that collection. So you can see here that the client push installation wizard is relatively easy, especially in the beginning after you've discovered your initial records, but it provides a nice easy way for you to deploy clients to those discovered resources that may not have the client installed to it. I'm going to cancel now, and I'm going to stop the recording while we wait for sccm Nugget to complete its client installation, and when we come back, we'll see that the client installation has completed and we're ready to begin managing this client as a configuration manager client. And we're back. And as I told you before we did the jump, what you really need to watch for in Task Manager is when the CCM setup process converts to a CCM exec process. Now that the CCM exec process is present in our system, you'll see it's beginning to collect some data. You'll see the CPU actually jumped here from 0 to 19 and back. So we are now actually managing this client through Configuration Manager. Once we've done that, we can actually verify that sccm Nugget has indeed a client here by refreshing this collection. I'm going to right-click and choose Update Collection Membership to verify that there's changes to the collection itself. And there are no sub-collections, but in this case we can also choose to update sub-collection membership as well. I'm going to update this membership. I'm going to say, okay, go ahead and provide me an updated view of what's going on with this collection. Then I'm going to go back and right-click and choose the refresh button to refresh the client. Now that I've refreshed the information and asked for a new view associated with the information, you'll see here that CCM Nugget has a site code assigned of CBN. You'll see here that the client is now showed as yes, it is approved, and it is currently currently assigned to the current site. We are not blocked. We have an advanced client. It is not obsolete, and it is currently active. So we have successfully deployed the client to sccm Nugget at this point. At this point, we can continue through all the clients if we want to, just like we talked about before, by right-clicking on All Systems and choosing to deploy the client. Here we see Install Client. I'm going to go ahead and deploy the client to all the systems in this domain, including sub-collections, and always installing and repairing, so that all the clients in the All Systems collections will automatically begin getting the client as we slowly deploy those clients out. It'll take a period of time, especially if there's a large number of systems in your domain, to get the client out. But again, what you want to do is keep refreshing that collection to make sure that you'll see those no's turn to yes. And when those no's turn to yes, you will have successfully deployed the client, and that will be a fully manageable client that you can now deploy software to and do all the fun things that we'll talk about in our later nuggets. However, at this point, while we're waiting for those clients to deploy, I actually want to go back to the client installation methods and show you the other client installation method that we skipped over earlier on in this nugget. This is software update point client installation. This is if we have a WSUS installation that we want to use in order to deploy clients, as opposed to doing it through the client push method or one of the other methods we talked about in the beginning of this nugget. By clicking the box here, I will be selected. I will be asked if I want to deploy the currently published version of the client package to my WSUS server. Do I want to publish that most recent to the software update point? If I click yes, you'll see they'll show the available version, and it will begin the process of publishing the version to the software update point. If I have not got these clients under management with Configuration Manager yet, but I do have them under management with WSUS, I'll need to make sure that that client is, the client installation is approved in my WSUS instance for me to be able to have the clients begin installing it as part of their WSUS refresh cycle. So that's the software update point client installation. The last thing that I want to show you as part of this nugget is actually the client itself. And the client is actually interacted with through Start, Control Panel, Configuration Manager. And you'll see this on the control panel of each of the clients that you actually have deployed on each of the workstations. You'll see here in general we have some information about the system properties. There's a site name and the client version and logged on user and MAC address, these sorts of things that are discovered from the computer itself. There are a number of components that are installed or enabled on this client as well. If I need to repair some components that I think may be having problems, I can click the repair button here. But these are the agents that are currently installed and are currently being used by my client, as we talked about the agents before. We have certain actions that we can do on each client as well. We can do a maintenance task for a branch distribution point. We can do a DDR collection cycle. We can do a file collection cycle, a hardware inventory cycle. All of these can be done by clicking the Initiate Action button here on the client as well. The Advanced button allows me to choose the site code or a DNS suffix associated with the site code, or even how much space I'm currently assigning the client for a temporary program download folder associated with that client. I can choose what sort of updates in terms of installing updates to the client itself or required software updates on the computer before the deadline. Do I want to manage those here at the client, or as we'll find out later on when we talk about software updates, do I want to manage that at the console, at the Configuration Manager console? And then lastly, I have enabled this desired Configuration Manager, and you'll see here that these configuration baselines, which we haven't set up yet, are currently assigned to this machine, and we'll see an example of that later when we talk about desired Configuration Manager. So this is the actual client itself, and this is an example of what a healthy client looks like, a client that is ready to begin being used in order to manage this as a Configuration Manager client. Let me go ahead and hit the click OK here and bring back up our slide here. And what did we talk about in this nugget? We talked about deploying Configuration Manager clients, and not only that, but also the boundaries associated with them and the approval associated with them and the agents associated with them. What sorts of components of the client itself do we want to enable or leave disabled in order to preserve performance on those client systems? We talked about how to install the client, the different installation methods of it. We talked very specifically about the client push installation method, because in some ways it's really just the easiest of all the installation methods. It may not be the most automated, but it's the easiest because you go right down to the system and click deploy client, and it's very, very easy. And then lastly, we looked at the Configuration Manager client itself and saw what a healthy client looks like, so that we can see, okay, well, we know verily that we have a Configuration Manager client on this system and is correctly working back and forth between it and the server. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.